Good morning. My name is Andrew Kuhn. I serve the Shelbina and Honeywell Methodist churches. And one of the ways I serve these churches is I am a bit of a storyteller. I tell the stories of the church across the centuries. And this late winter, early spring in 2022, I offered to tell the story of the Methodist Church. How do we go from John and Charles Wesley to the Methodist Church as we know it today? I think it's a fascinating story. And I had some people ask me, well, can you put these stories online on YouTube? And so here we go. I want to make sure everyone who wants to hear these stories can, because I think they're great. And there's nothing novel or new what I'm doing. Other people have told these stories as well, if not better than I have. But this is how I think of where the church begins. Before we jump into John Wesley, we got to sort of take this first session to set the stage, to sort of establish what is the situation into which Wesley is born. It's a very different context in the 18th century. Wesley is born in the early first couple of years of the 18th century, and it's a very different context than the one that we live in today. He was born into a kingdom, and democracy was just not. It wasn't even thought about. He was born into a kingdom, into a time in which there was great tension. Well, there had been great tension between the British king and the Pope. The politics of the 2 centuries leading up to the 18th century, when John is born, had been a time when the British king was at odds with France. And Italy, which had stereotypically over the centuries controlled who was going to be Pope, the Italian cardinals. A cardinal is a bishop of a church in Rome, and it's when the cardinals get together. The cardinals are the ones who pick who the Pope will be. So in the Roman Catholic Church, you can be ordained a deacon, a priest, and then a bishop. And then after you're a bishop, you can get fancier hats. That's not quite how they explain it, but that's how I think of it. You can get better job titles. A bishop who gets to be in charge of a church in Rome is a bishop who is called a cardinal, and then the Pope is a bishop who is in charge of the biggest church in Rome, the Cathedral of St. Peter's. So that process, as you may have noticed, Rome is in Italy. So Italy had controlled who was going to be Pope for a long time. And then for a period of time, French bishops ended up controlling who was going to be Pope. And during this time, when France controlled who was going to be Pope, then that is that 100-year-ish time. That's about the same time of the 100 Years' War between France and England. And so, like, the politics of the time were deeply enmeshed between the politics of the kings and the politics of the church, because whoever was in charge, like, there was this running argument, something called the investiture problem, the investiture controversy, like, who was going to pick who would be bishops in England? Was it going to be the king, or was it going to be the Pope? Because whoever picked who was going to be bishops in England, they had a lot of sway in the church hierarchy. And the church hierarchy included the monasteries, and the monasteries are where the money was. This was in a time before paper currency, and so the money was limited by how much gold or how much silver you could mine, and so there was only as much money in circulation as there was precious metal that had been discovered. And so controlling who controlled the bishops, who controlled the monasteries, that had a significant impact on who controlled the money. So this is the context of that time leading up to Wesley's times, and it's the time right after the Reformation, this 200-year period before going up to Wesley, had included what we think of as the Reformation, when Martin Luther, at the beginning of the 16th century, Martin Luther is a Catholic who was protesting how the Catholic Church was running. And so he protested and protested and protested, and thus becomes known as a Protestant. And so in 1530, this is all going on with Martin Luther. And the Church of England And the Church begins very, very soon after this when the King of England, who wants to have a male heir, isn't having any male heirs. He's having daughters, like the daughters who we will eventually know as Queen Mary, Bloody Mary, and Queen Elizabeth, right? But he's not having any boys. He needs to have a boy for dynastic succession, and so he needs to divorce his wife so he can get a new wife, because obviously the problem is not with him. The problem is with the wife. They didn't really understand the biology of how sex was determined at that point, so he didn't realize it was futile. If you can have boys with this wife, he wasn't going to be able to have boys with any other. But he didn't know that. So he goes to divorce his wife. The problem is the Pope won't approve. And the Pope, because his wife is related to the Pope, and the Pope is not going to let one of his close relatives be cast aside like that. You can't kick out my cousin, or niece. I forget if it was cousin or niece, but you can't kick my family to the curb like that. And so the King of England, who has seen the church split, has gone from the Catholic Church to now having the Catholic and the Lutheran and the Reformed, what we would now call Presbyterian Church. He looks around and says, I can do the same thing. And so he does. The Church of England forms. And it's a fascinating thing because it forms so that the king can get his divorce and marry someone else. But he doesn't change how the church actually runs. At first, the Church of England is like a splinter off of the Catholic Church. It's Catholic in every way it's doing things, except it doesn't report to the Pope. It reports to the King of England. Okay, so now we get through now the Church of England starts bouncing. Because when it comes to who is going to be an heir, it depends whether the king was legitimate when he divorced his wife or not. And so the first, the Queen Mary becomes the next leader of England, but she is the daughter of the queen that was divorced from that first marriage. And so she has to take the England and make it Catholic again, bring it back to the Catholic Church, because for her to be legitimate, her father can't have divorced her mother. And so she has to say that it actually didn't happen, and you can't actually split the church. So she brings the church back she brings England and its church back to the Pope and says, forgive us, let us come back. And the Pope, of course, says, fine. And a fascinating thing happens there. First, she has a drink named after her, Bloody Mary. That's what she's known as to history, is Bloody Mary. And that's what is the name of the drink we have today with tomato juice and vodka, Bloody Mary. It is not that she was particularly vicious with regards to how many people she had killed, any more than or less than any other monarch of the day. It's that there was a very concerted PR effort to besmirch her name. There was a whole book called Fox's Book of the Martyrs that intentionally told all the stories of the people that Queen Mary had killed to sort of rile up this sort of anti-Catholic sense in the Church of England. And the other thing that happens is all the people who wanted the Church of England, the churches in England, to sort of become more Protestant, to get the Bible into the hands of the people, to preach in a language that people can hear, understand, all that. Those folks are driven out of England during her reign. And so they go to the continent. They go and they learn from Luther or his proteges. They go to Calvin, Zwingli, in the Swiss over in Sweden, and learn what was going on over there. And so when Queen Mary's reign is over, Queen Elizabeth takes over. And Queen Elizabeth, she is a child by the king of the next wife. And so she has to take the Church of England and say, no, we really were split off from the Roman Catholic Church, or else I would be illegitimate, a bastard in the technical sense of the term, a child born of illegitimate parentage. So Queen Elizabeth does something, and she does it for a long time. Well, first, she's queen for decade after decade after decade, so she has time to make this sink in. And the thing that she does with the church is she establishes what's called the Via Media, the middle way. as in, like, you can keep a very high liturgical way of doing worship that feels very Catholic, very formal. And all those folks who come back to Britain after studying on the continent, you can start implementing the changes, the reforms to the institution of the church, so that it is more friendly to the laity, so that it's you can bring all of this way of thinking about the Bible back, and you can preach that, and so everyone gets something of what they want. People in the pews get their way of worship they're used to, and people don't like how they worship to be changed. Just think about how much people argue about what type of music there is in church today. It's the same thing, just a few centuries ago. And the people who care deeply about what the church proclaims, they get what they want too. And then the sticking point, she says, is, but you have to all do two things. You have to acknowledge me as queen. I'm in charge. And second, you can't like Catholics. Can't have Catholics. Not going to like them. We are not going to deal with Catholics. And that actually is ensconced in the 39 Articles of Religion. They put together the basis of the Church of England. What do we believe are the 39 Articles of Religion. And so we get things like, it's Article 22, that purgatory, the article on purgatory. Purgatory is a Romish doctrine concerning the Romish doctrine concerning purgatory pardons worshiping and adoration, as well as images and relics. Is a fond thing. To call something fond is not a compliment at that time. It's a fond thing, vainly invented and grounded upon no warranty of Scripture, but rather repugnant to God. Article 25 says that there are two sacraments, and that there are folks who say there are five more, that this is a corruption. The 28th article. Transubstantiation is repugnant to the plain word of Scripture, and that you should not reserve communion. You eat it all when you're there, and anything that you keep afterwards, that's not communion anymore. That's okay, you've had communion, it's when you're gathered together. Article 30, that everyone gets both the bread and the cup. Article 31, that Mass is not a repeat of a sacrifice, and to say that Mass does so is a blasphemous fable, a dangerous deceit. These 39 articles of the Church of England, these are what John Wesley would be raised into. His father was a priest, and so when he becomes a Church of England priest, because that's what he is, these are the articles of faith that he would have proclaimed. And so it's a fascinating thing, because it's we get a sign, and one of the earliest things Wesley does, that he is not a big fan of Catholics, because he was raised to not like Catholics, because you can't trust a Catholic because they're just going to do whatever the Pope wants, so you don't have to keep your word to them, because they'll break their word to you in a heartbeat, because they follow the Pope, not the Queen, like a good Englishman should, right? So he has this, he was raised in this way of thinking. But then when he starts gathering people together, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but when he starts gathering people together, he doesn't say anyone can come except if you're Catholic. He says anyone who can come if you seek to flee the wrath to come. That was the requirement to join a Methodist small group, a desire to flee the wrath to come. And that gets at sort of the last detail I want to make sure that we get at, is that in this time frame, they had a different really focus on the nature of who Jesus was. Today, if we wanted to focus on what was Jesus most adamant about, what is Jesus stubborn about, what would Jesus dig in about, we would say that Jesus really focused on forgiving people and loving people. And back then, in this 18th century, in this time leading up to it, the focus was far more on that Jesus is the righteous one who judges those who are and who are not. And so in this time period, there was like the Marian devotions, the Ave Maria, the Hail Mary, stuff like that. That's two of the 7 Marian devotions, the 2 that survive to this day in common practice. And it was rooted in this understanding, like we have these statues we can find of Mary looking up to heaven. And then under her skirts, their big, voluminous skirts. There would be people like hiding under the skirts, and you could see their faces looking up, these carved stone faces looking up around the skirts. And it gets at this understanding that, like, if we can just ask Mary to protect us from her son, because I'm not worthy, but if we go to Mary, we'll ask that Mary pray for us, because Jesus would have to do whatever his mama asks. And that gets at this understanding, like, to join the Methodist groups of the time, it wasn't the requirement wasn't anyone who loves Jesus, come along, let's do this. The requirement was a desire to flee the wrath to come, because Jesus was the one who judged. Okay, that sort of sets the framework for where Wesley is born. Wesley is born up in Epworth in England. His dad was a priest, a bit of a scholar. His mom was the one who taught. The way that he was taught to read was, here's the book of Genesis 1:1, let's do this, right? So he's taught to read using Genesis 1. He is one of 10 children. There are 18 children born, 8 of them die, 10 survive. And then we'll pick up next time when he goes off to college at Oxford. Methodism sort of has 3 moments where it gets started, and then, well, the first 2, it gets started and kind of stalls out. So next time we're going to look at the first time the Methodist way of following Jesus sort of starts up at Oxford. If you have any questions about this, please let me know, and I'll continue these sort of story times. I'll be doing this after worship for the next couple weeks if you want to jump in and hear this in person. Have a good day.